Hello, I'm Ian Kiehle, and I'm here in the BCTV studio, joined by Ron Stahlety and Frank Rucker. And I'm going to be asking them a few questions about Act 46, which has to do with basically school district consolidation, I guess would be.
School governance.
School governance. Right. And then just for perhaps an introduction, Ron, you are the superintendent of schools at the Windham Southeast Supervisory Union.
That's right.
And I'm sort of familiar with that term, the Windham Southeast Supervisory Union. Which towns does that encompass in terms of schools?
Yeah, so that's Brattleboro and the surrounding towns of Putney, Dummerston, Vernon, and Guilford.
Okay. And Frank, you are the business administrator of the Windham Southeast Supervisory Union.
That's right.
Okay. And I thought I'd just ask sort of some background. I think I've asked you this before. I don't know if it was on camera, Ron, but how did you end up becoming the superintendent of schools here?
That's a good question. I taught in Massachusetts for 14 years. Got my degree in educational administration back in the late 70s. Decided I wanted to become a principal. Actually came up to Northern Vermont for a principal's position. Then came down to Leland and Gray Union High School in Townsend and worked as a principal there for 8 years. And after that, I became the assistant superintendent in Windham Central Supervisory Union. And then 13 years ago, I was hired as superintendent here in this district.
Okay. And Frank, your background as business administrator, I'm thinking that you're relatively new to the supervisory union?
I am, yes. Okay. Yeah. I replaced Jim Kane, who was very well regarded after 35 years of work in Windham Southeast. So that was in July of 2014. So it's been just a little more than a year, but I was in Windham Central for 26 years, where Ron had mentioned he had been as well. So I worked with Ron for several years there. And before that, I was in the private sector for finance positions. I have a degree in from Northeastern in finance, and not too long ago, Ron and I went through a UMass cohort program in education policy, research, and administration. So,
I thought this would be a good time to ask about this sort of. I guess it's the structure of public school governance. You two represent the Windham Southeast Supervisory Union. You made a reference to the Windham Central Supervisory Union. So this idea of a supervisory union, is this sort of universal across the state?
Well, I believe there's probably like 46 supervisory unions throughout Vermont, and then there are some supervisory districts. I think there's like 14 of those. So there's some sort of governance structure for all of the schools in Vermont.
And then this, is it about, from your list, it's about 5 towns, is that correct?
Well, yeah, 5 towns, 6 boards, actually 7 boards when you can include the supervisory union board. Okay. That represents all of the schools. But so Brattleboro Town School District has a board, and then Guilford, Vernon, Dummerston, and Putney, and then BUHS 6 has a regional high school board. And
then just the idea would be that, would that be sort of a standard thing that you'd have roughly about 5 towns in a supervisory union, or is it
not necessarily?
More varied?
I think it's geographic. Okay. Windham Central had, what, 10 or 11 towns. Mm-hmm. Okay. Windham Southwest probably has about 6 or 7 towns. Windham Northeast, probably 6 or 7.
Okay.
It kind of depends on the geographic area and the, where the numbers of students are and how schools have developed and evolved.
And then Windham County would be covered by roughly how many supervisory unions?
4.
4.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, for the audience, we're going to be soon discussing Act 46. But I thought we'd do a little bit of sort of history, since we have some experts here on school governance and public school governance and financing. And so we go back to 1997, which was Act 60, which thanks to looking it up online, I've discovered it was called the Equal Educational Opportunity Act, and it was brought on by a Vermont Supreme Court decision, Brigham versus the state in 1996. Yeah. And either of you can correct me, but it was basically coming down to the idea that the argument was that towns with a small property tax base, their schools were at a disadvantage in terms generally of financing, but also equal opportunity to the educational system. And so this Act 60 in 1997 tried to equal out, sort of, to use the terms, poor towns and rich towns, so that it didn't matter which town a student came from, they would have the same educational opportunity. Yep. And I'm just curious if either of you, have some experience with that implementation when Act 60 came about, or
yeah,
do you want to share any?
We both did. We worked in the same district as that was happening, and I really believe that at that time, 1996, 97, I'm sure there were other people throughout the state, but I knew Frank Rucker, working closely with him, and Jim Kane, who they worked together quite a bit, were two people that we could rely on for understanding the implications of Act 60, because it was pretty different in terms of equalized pupils and the towns that were contributing to the Ed Fund and the towns that were gaining from the Ed Fund, and all of the aspects around that legislation. I do know from an educational quality perspective, that's when the state implemented the school action plan process, and that was tied to the idea of equal opportunities for students and tracking the outcomes of individual schools, and then looking at it in terms of the broad governance structure.
So we're saying that what you're emphasizing is that Act 60 simply wasn't about financing. It also brought in these elements of sort of tracking of school performance. Right. Okay. And then my understanding was that Act 60 was amended in 2003 by Act 68, which I'm presuming there was some influence with. I remember certain rich towns actually brought legal cases against the state in trying to maybe mitigate some of what they felt were harmful effects. And I'm just curious if you folks have any memories or insight into, were there changes in 2003 with Act 68 that sort of?
Several changes, yeah. 2003 and then 2010 and 2012. And all of them were attempts to address the transition away from the old system that most folks, I would guess, still are more familiar with than they are today in terms of funding the public system. So at the town meeting, folks are accustomed to a select board bringing a budget, understanding the grand list, and then understanding the relationship between spending at the town level and taxation based on the grand list. Act 60 completely changed that landscape, and the acts that you are referring to generally tried to mitigate the complexity or maybe some of the unanticipated consequences of the original act. But what it's done is it's completely separated school spending from in a tax impact relationship to a grand list. There is no relationship any longer. You can't take spending and your grand list and get to a tax rate directly. It's a school funding formula. We can talk about that more if you're interested in some of the variables. But the various acts tried to address some of the unanticipated consequences.
I think Ron used earlier the term equalized pupil, and I'm curious what that term means and how that is used in terms of school funding.
The intent of it is to take to recognize that different groups of kids need different interventions and different resources to be successful. So the equalization part of counting students and then allocating resources to students that may need more resources than others is to essentially assign a weighting index to the student count that exists in your building. So an example is This time of year, all schools, all public schools in Vermont will send data to the state. It's called the Student Census Data Collection. The state will take our enrollments as they are today, and then they will go to the tax department data, and they will assign a weighting of 0.2 to students that are from a lower socioeconomic or what's considered in poverty. They'll assign that weighting to that student count that exists in any particular town. They also assign a weight for students where English is not the primary language, the ESL student. And then at the high school, because there's so much more programming like driver's education and the career counseling and other support at the high school level, there's another weighting assigned for that. That is the equalization concept, where the higher student count divided by spending, a school budget, lowers the cost per student, right? And the whole funding formula and the tax rate is driven on a cost per student index. So if you have a lower cost per student, the idea there is that the school board, the administration, the community is willing to take some of that lower rate and reinvest it in the interventions that we need for students that are at risk of failing school.
Okay.
I think, you know, when you look at the whole state as an average, clearly some of the smaller districts that have a hard time managing those class sizes contribute to that higher per pupil cost.
Yeah, I would just emphasize that when the State Board of Ed in the Equal Education Opportunity Act essentially says that we want a comprehensive curriculum at every school. So you're going to offer math and science and the language arts and the humanities, regardless of how many kids you have. So as Ron is saying, when you have a required curriculum, regardless of how many kids are available in your town region, in a rural system, you're going to have higher costs per student, a lower number of students per teacher. And we know in schools it's primarily a people business, it's salary and benefits, so that accounts for most of that.
I think this is the perfect segue to get into what we sort of wanted to talk about, which was Act 46. And I just wanted to let viewers know that the Secretary of Education was in Brattleboro recently speaking at a Vermont School Board Association regional meeting. And she was here speaking specifically about Act 46, and that's available on BCTV, and it's really probably worth watching because you'll get really straight from the top on that. And then also Nicole Mace, who's the Executive Director of the Vermont School Board Association, also spoke about Act 46. And yet more BCTV viewing. Ron, you spoke recently at a recent PUHS number 6 meeting, speaking with that particular board about Act 46. I guess I'd ask you also, is this a discussion similar to what it was actually videotaped by BCTV at BUHS 6 number 6 meeting. Is that sort of a similar conversation that you've been having at these other school board
absolutely. At each school board meeting, we've devoted time to talk about Act 46 and the implications. So, you know, we look at the pathway to this legislation that was passed that talks about a preferred structure of governance, which would be a pre-K-12 single board. You know, that's kind of a fast track, accelerated model they talk about. And then there's a conventional process where a year later, again, it would be considering a pre-K-12 board. And at that time, other districts, neighboring districts, might want to join the supervisory district in that case. And the third model is what they call an alternative structure, which is essentially doing a self-assessment and making the case that your current structure is achieving all of the equity and education quality opportunities for students in your current structure. So we've been talking about that. We've been talking about the benefits as we see them with the consolidated program. We know that each board needs to decide if they want to enter into a study committee to work on this. You know, at some point it's going to happen to us anyway, and so my job is to advise the boards early on about, you know, this is what we see as the accelerated structure, this is what we see with the conventional, and this is what we would see if we do the self-assessment. With this law, there are tax incentives for the first two options, for the accelerated and for the conventional. At this time, there are no tax incentives to maintain the status quo.
And would it be correct to say that I think the word that came up quite a bit when the Secretary Holcomb said was equity. Mm-hmm. It was a very persistent theme of Act 46. And would it be fair to characterize sort of what Act 46 is it's to sort of use the concept of nudging. In a certain sense, it's sort of trying to nudge individual school boards or school districts toward a sort of more, are we looking at that? It seems that there's a desire from the legislative level of sort of consolidating multiple boards into districts. And to sort of use an example of our neck of the woods, would one model for the future be, instead of referring to the Windham Southeast Supervisory Union, we would be referring to the Windham Southeast Supervisory District?
That's right.
Okay. Yeah. And then to use that as a potential model for the future, we would be talking about, whereas currently exists, we have individual school boards for the towns of Putney, Guilford, Dummerston, Brattleboro, as well as the BUHS 6 board, that would essentially, those boards would become, in a sense, transformed into one board. That's right. That would oversee all of K through 12 education within the towns we spoke of.
That's right. That's right. And another component of this legislation is, it's not written in the law, but the Agency of Education has supported it. I talked to the Secretary early on when the law was passed, that we would want to maintain school-based advisory councils. So that would look like each school, each town, district, would have the board representative from the supervisory district board, along with the principal, parents, community members, as a school council. And quite frankly, I think those school councils would be advocating for their individual schools the type of support that they would be looking for from the supervisory district board.
I guess it would make sense to ask about your current Windham Southeast Supervisory Union board. And could you tell me how that board is formed, or how individuals get on that board, and sort of what terms they serve, since that may be similar to what the future may hold?
The supervisory board is essentially 3 representatives from each of the smaller district boards. And we probably meet quarterly or 5 times a year, essentially to kind of coordinate services early on in the year. And then when we have the supervisory union budget in December, we have that board come together, and there's a finance committee, a supervisory union finance committee that works probably, I don't know, every 3rd week. They get together and work with Frank on financial and educational issues. They bring that information to the supervisory union board. We do policy discussion and approval at that level. And so it's a supervisory union policy implementation. Each board has 3 representatives to that as voting members of that board.
It was obvious that your board sets your budget.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. But the question is, where does that funding come from? Is that straight from
it's an assessment for each district based on per pupil costs, per pupil, equalized pupil rates. And so things like now special ed, transportation, English language learners, teachers of English language learners, some of the educational support services, certainly the administrative costs, that's all part of the supervisory union budget. And there's an assessment to each district. The Frank works very closely with the supervisory union finance committee to establish that budget.
To me, just as an individual, I'm curious about why the desire is, at least from the legislative level, of a K through 12 view.
There was this attitude that maybe there's a pre-K through 8 board and maintaining the Union High School board, but I think through a lot of discussion they decided a pre-K 12 board makes a lot of sense, and from my perspective they're all of our students. So to think that so there's this one entity, a board governing elementary and middle school students, and then we have a different entity governing the high school students. In my mind, it doesn't make sense. I think the Secretary of Education very clearly talks about promoting the fact that these are all of our students. It shouldn't be a delineation based on town borders. If we're looking at pooling our resources, then it really is the concept of all of our students. I will tell you this, when we consolidated special ed services through this last budget, we did save $300,000 in costs. And the interesting thing is, that wasn't the intent of the consolidation from our perspective. It was to better utilize services throughout the whole supervisory union in individual district schools. And by doing that, it actually saved us quite a bit of money. And so we're looking at this and saying, okay, besides the tax incentives, how do we equalize the opportunities for students that in some schools they have better programming than some of the smaller schools, and how can we do it at a reasonable cost so it's not adding to the taxpayer's burden? And quite frankly, I think the special ed consolidation helped me think that this is a good opportunity for us.
So in the specific case of the Windham Southeast Supervisory Union, we have the Brattleboro Town School Board, which covers 3 elementary schools and this early education services. And then am I thinking that Guilford, Vernon, Putney, and Dummerston each represent just one elementary school?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And so if, I suppose, would we be looking at each one of those 6 entities would have to have the desire to either choose the accelerated merger or the conventional merger?
Yeah, let me talk about the process. Right now we're engaging in discussion with each board whether they, in order to do this, you have to form a study committee. Okay. And the study committee has to have representation from all of your district boards. And so to proceed with at least the accelerated version, you would need an affirmative vote by each individual district board to entertain or engage in the study committee. And what the study committee does is have a representative group of the of those districts really study the options, look at the accelerated, the conventional, and the self-assessment. And it's through that process that they would make a recommendation to the state board, actually. And so let's say all of our districts join in the study committee, and they do work now from late October through December or mid-December, and come up with an analysis that it makes sense for us to proceed with the accelerated structure. That's just one option. Then each individual town would need to vote affirmatively to that, let's say presumably at their town meeting. Okay. So that would be a warrant article for every individual district to decide that. So we would have all of the things about the benefits, the pros and cons, the financial implications, and we would hope that there's a consensus from the study committee that is directing us to one of the options. If by chance we opted for the conventional merger, that would be a year out. That allows other neighboring districts to join us in a process. So if there were neighboring towns that wanted to join the supervisory district, they would have the opportunity to do that in the second year. Again, their towns would need to vote affirmatively to support that. And then if the study committee chose the alternative structure, the self-assessment, we would then need to convince the state board that the process that we use right now provides the same equity and equal opportunity for students as we would have with a supervisory district. So the time frame for this is probably early November to organize a study committee and then start looking at the options and bringing it to the voters probably as early as warning articles by the end of January for the town meeting votes. And if it doesn't work out that way, then it would probably be for the next year.
And then I think you mentioned, perhaps it was off camera, but for the audience we could let them know there's a good resource online at the state's, is the Agency of Education website is the place to look.
Yeah, I think if you look at the Agency of Education, the Vermont Agency of Education, and continue to put in Act 46, you get to a page that has a lot of resources on the whole process.
Okay. Yep. We can share that with viewers.
Yep.
I think we pretty much covered as many questions as I can come up with, and I know that ideally this will stimulate more discussion, because I understand that this is a topic that there will be much discussion about.
It is important. We need, the public to understand and be engaged, because it's a big decision and it is coming right up.
Yeah, and I want to thank BCTV, which has always been a wonderful resource. Currently, in terms of education, you can often see the BUHS number 6 board meeting. Those are videotaped for broadcast, and currently also the Brattleboro Town School Board meetings are also broadcast. Thanks again for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Me too.